My name is Mary-Beth Laviolette. I don't have any formal training in craft, although I used to do a lot of knitting and I still love embroidery. I just have a love of craft, and I've had the great opportunity to serve for the last 10 years on the board of the Alberta Craft Council, where I have learned a lot about craft. And also, I lived in Calgary and am not too far from the city now, and it has a pretty active craft scene. And also at the art college, or now the university, they have a master's program in fine craft, which I think is the only one in the country. So all of those kinds of things, it's kind of a building process where you start to absorb many things and start to curate exhibitions or act as a juror or whatever. Well, I thought one of the most interesting things about this exhibition was this emphasis on community. And community can be a many tentacled sort of creature. It can be a cultural community. It can be a community that is united together by the love of a certain craft. For example, I think of Barbara Heller and her interest in European tapestry. And then, of course, we have a great example of some Chilkat weaving, which is part of the coastal First Nations traditions. So I think that's one kind of community. I think also there's what I call a sort of activist community, where works have sort of a pretty strong environmental theme. So I think, for example, of Debbie Katz's Salmon Run. I think of someone like Amy Gorherty with this very powerful, beautifully glazed piece called Container Ship, which really speaks about Vancouver and what's out there in the waters. I also think about Bettina Matskewen as well, and her concern for our disappearing glaciers and that sort of thing. So I see that as more of an activist theme. There's other kinds of things as well too that are going on. Some of this is very personal work, and I think, for example, of Monica Urbaniak's large jewelry brooch about that big called Coming Home, and it's a piece about her finding a place on the coast of British Columbia. I think about someone like Lou Lin with her 3 shovels, where she's kind of reinterpreted what a shovel can do. Well, she comes out of a very agricultural community in the BC interior and is very actively involved in a lot of horticulture. So there's just those kinds of personal interests that get reflected as well too. It might be a bit of a stretch because Modern in the Making contains about 300 works or objects or whatever you wish to call them. This exhibition only has about 27 works, but I think you can really see that this is a much more kind of contemporary expression of craft. Craft, I mean, God, it went through this amazing revival in the 50s and 60s, and it was very much about, well, there was a lot of interest in the avant-garde, in modernism, in simplicity, just in this whole idea of doing something that is about progress, like this is my new material, and so on and so forth. I don't sense from these artists that there is that kind of strong interest. It's a more complicated scene, I think, now, because although there were certainly active Indigenous makers in that 50s, 60s, 70s art scene, I think that they have become more, their contribution has really become more pronounced. And, you know, they're drawing on some of the traditions of their own culture. I think of Marlene Little, for example, with this extraordinary clam basket, and made out of yellow and red cedar. And she's got her own treatment. She's created her own treatment of those baskets. And one of the very identifiable marks of her work is the knot of a cedar tree, which she has included in the basket. So yes, I think there's a more pronounced presence of Indigenous crafters, if I can call them that. But I think overall it's a pretty strong and varied scene, and with kind of less emphasis on the new and the avant-garde and whatever, which was so much a part of modern in the making. Well, that's a good question. I mean, because I think there is certainly a very, there's an aesthetic that really is quite connected to the environment, and I think you see that reflected in a number of different ways. I think of, for example, of Nancy Walker, which is her beautiful porcelain of, you know, it's whiter than white porcelain, and she's drawing on an old kind of Christian theme about Noah's Ark. But this one she calls Hope, and it's really about, it really kind of talks about the environment and what people or what animals and whatever are faced with today. So there's that kind of narrative, there's storytelling. In the modern period, there was not a lot of interest in narrative and storytelling. It was more formal, the shape, the design, the discipline of a particular craft tradition, and so on. So it's quite different that way. And you know what's the other thing that's interesting is a number of these makers are actually out of that kind of 60s generation, but they are still working today, and they are also having content that is quite narrative. It's telling stories. And I think again of Barbara Heller's piece about the three fates. Or someone like Deborah Sloan with the story of Adam and Eve, the Christian couple. And there's young people as well too, but yeah, I think people have a way bigger interest in conveying content that has to do with more than the formal aspects of a work of art. Yes, look at this here, and look at Catherine Thompson's piece. This piece by Michelle Sirois Silver is made, it's an extraordinary piece of hooking, hand hooking, and it's made out of waste hosiery. And then of course we look at this extraordinary knitted, if I can call it a veil, I'm not exactly sure. Well, it's more about surface design of Catherine Thompson. Instead of using very fine thread or silk for this knitted work, she has used tencel fiber, which is made out of wood fiber tencel. So again, there's another example of someone who's dealing with Shetland lace. Knitting is very, very old, but yet she's really kind of updated it with a different material, tencel thread. I think there's more acknowledgement too of one's ancestral heritage. That wasn't important in the 60s or the 50s or whatever. People weren't really concerned with issues of representation, issues of identity, and whatever. And in a piece like, for example, by Carrie Wu, which is this beautiful pendant of a very unconventional kind of construction. It's the story of her family, her Chinese family, coming from China and settling in Alberta over a century ago. So there's much more interest in that. And then, of course, our Indigenous makers in this exhibition also reflect on their community, their cultural community, their historic community, and still their ties. And I also think of, about family. And there are several pieces besides Carrie Wu where Basil the stonemason and the artist's mother is beautifully embroidered on an old tablecloth. You think about the family roots. I mean, talking about family 40 years ago was just considered so sentimental and so, what's the word? It's just, people just didn't do it.